thoughts that came up. Across the world, this was a time of great political, cultural, social, and economic tumult. The order that came about in the post-World War II world, it appeared, was being shaken at its foundations. As this audience hardly needs to know, 1945 to 47, 49 marked not only the end of the World War II, and the beginning of the Cold War between the two great blocs led by the Soviet Union and United States. It was also the time when there was a process of decolonization, particularly in Asia and Africa. And India was central, certainly in the World War, 2 million Indians fought in it. It was one of the arenas of the Cold War, though the Indian leadership kept out from the two great armed battle camps. And it was also a very significant place in terms of leading the process of the end of empire. It's interesting that in 1947 to 50, the new rulers of India, after a very long time, were men. There were very few women. If you look at the first cabinet of independent India, the only woman was Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, who of course held the health ministry portfolio. But for the first time, there were men who did not go into the jungle with a gun. Writing in one of the early issues of Shankar's Weekly, edited by the editor of what was the Shankar's Weekly, that he brought out a magazine called Children's World. And Nehru wrote about how if you go into the forest not with a gun, but with friendship in your mind and heart, the animals of the forest will come and befriend you. Somewhat romantic, idealistic view. But I think this is a very significant moment when Rajaji, the first Governor General, who was an Indian, took over office. He was told he had shooting rights in the Shivaliks, and he renounced them. And this area became a wildlife sanctuary, the nucleus of what is now the Rajaji National Park. The first Indian to be head of state, Babu Rajendra Prasad, visited Somnath and stopped over in the Gir forest, where, unlike his predecessor, previous head of state who had visited the Gir forest was both the Viceroy and the plenipotentiary of His Imperial Majesty, Linditgau. He shot a lion in the Gir forest. But I think it's important to remember that the years from 47 to 67, in fact, one can go backward, the years from 39 to 67 was something like free for all in terms of forests and wildlife. The origins of this lay in the Second World War, when the British Empire, not only the British Indian Empire, the British Empire globally, was fighting for its life. Major battlefields lay not only in Europe and North Africa or in the Pacific, but across the Asian mainland and seaboard. And in this situation, the forests were commandeered for supplies for war. So timber cutting of the forests, clear felling of areas and the grow more food campaigns, distribution of gun licenses, which had earlier been some sort of tight-fisted, the elimination of large numbers of herbivores, both to feed prisoners of war and also to protect crops, were very widespread. Might interest you to know over 3,000 elephants from Burma and India were captured, trained, and sent off into the battlefields of Southeast Asia. In the early years of independent India, many of the ideas of the Raj continued untrammeled. So right into the 50s and 60s, can someone please put off that mic? Can everyone else silence their mics? I can hear someone else. Thank you. Thank you very much. So if you look at the 1950s and 60s, sport hunting and safaris were encouraged by the Indian government in order to gain. Jack Denton Scott visited India. He was a guest of the government. He wrote a well-known book called The Forests of Night. And one of the characters in the book comes up around the time that the tiger became Indian. In 1966, India had a new prime minister, the first woman prime minister, so far the only one, only the third in the world, Indira Gandhi. In his work, Indira, A Life in Nature, Jairam Ramesh has given us a lot of evidence, and there's been evidence even before, that long before she became prime minister, Indira Gandhi was deeply interested in the question of nature. In the 1950s, she had been president of the Delhi Birdwatchers Society. In 1960, she was on a visit to British East Africa, primarily to meet the East African nationalists. They were very important aides of future statesmen such as Nyerere and Kaunda in Central Africa, who met with her. And on one of the trips, she went to Masai Mara, which adjoins the famous Serengeti. And she wrote a fascinating letter. In those days, people wrote letters. She started writing letters to her father at the age of 10. There are two fascinating volumes, Two Alone, Two Together, and Freedom's Daughter. And several of the letters point to her fascination with nature, wildlife, and with science. So this letter describes the lion, the zebra, the giraffe, and the wildebeest. Now, in the late 1960s, it was a time of intense political and economic crisis in many countries. And in India, there was a very particular dimension to the crisis, which is that the monsoon failed not once, but twice. There have been 3 such double failures in the 20th century, and this was the first one since independence. India had been a net food importer in 1951, and in 1966-67, it imported over 19 to 20 million tons of wheat. It was very difficult to pay for the wheat, and there was a PL 480 agreement with the United States. This led to the turbocharging and fast tracking of what was already unfolding, the process known as the Green Revolution. But closely related to this, or rather running on a parallel track, was a new awareness of the significance of forests, of natural vegetation, and of wildlife in terms of the relationship between hydrology, the health of the soil, and the availability of water year-round. It is evident to anybody who has a sense of India's geography that along with 19 other states in Asia and Africa, these are countries that are dependent on the monsoon. There is a phenomenon in which 80 to 90% of the water is concentrated in a period of around 60 to 100 days in the year, or 180 days in the year. And the importance of forests for maintaining the water regime was emphasized in a very interesting speech she gave in Bangalore University, the first university convocation address which she delivered after becoming Prime Minister, where she talked about how multi-purpose development projects were leading to large-scale deforestation, of how forests were important not just but in terms of climatic security, in terms of water, and in terms of ensuring that agriculture and human living would occur on a stable basis. So these years between 66 and 69 see a lot of debate about spot hunting. There is advisors who gained the ear of not only the Prime Minister, but of some of the other very important people in New Delhi. The Congress, of course, had suffered very serious reverses. It had only 283 seats out of 521. I know this sounds like a lot, but at that time, it looked like the heavens that the sky had crashed on the political leadership. It had also been booted out of power in 7 states. Around this time, and by 1969 quite clearly, Mrs. Gandhi made a very clear turn to the left. In 69-70, there was the nationalization of banks, the abolition of privy purses, culminating in the early dissolution of parliament, and an election in which her slogan was abolish poverty or Garibi Hatao. In a little noticed essay, the biologist and leading tiger scholar, Dr. Ullas Karanth, he wrote an essay in the year 2000 in the Hindu Annual called Making Space for Nature. And Dr. Karanth, of course, besides being a biologist, is someone who has a very deep knowledge of Kannada history, culture, and society. His recent book with his 2 siblings, Growing Up Karanth, gives us a sense of his depth of understanding of Indian politics. It's not something he likes to boast about, but I will illustrate because I think it's very central to my argument this evening. Karanth argued that in 69, 70, 71, Mrs. Indira Gandhi and her government, the Indian Board of Wildlife, was reinvigorated. The youngest minister, he was only 32 in January of 66, Dr. Karan Singh, was made the chairman of the Indian Board for Wildlife. The joke then, and he's a man of great humor, a gentleman with very self-depreciating art. He was chairman of the Nehru Museum. I had the privilege working with him, and I asked him why this was so, and he said, he denied, half jokingly, that it was not because his nickname was Tiger. That's what he was called by his parents. Now, the Indian Board for Wildlife took steps by 1969 to ban the export of tiger skins. By 1970, they started taking steps to outlaw tiger hunting and safaris as well. And there's a very major transformation where these wild animals were not seen anymore as a source of foreign exchange, but as part of the natural heritage. In 1969, speaking to the Indian International Union for the Conservation of Nature at its meeting in Delhi, Mrs. Gandhi said that we do need foreign exchange, but not at the cost of the life and liberty of some of the most beautiful four-footed and feathered inhabitants of our land. It's a very interesting sentence. She has transformed the animals and the birds into fellow Indians and is beginning to argue that their lives are important because of their intrinsic worth. They cannot be measured only in terms of money. In another speech made a few years later, she talked about the narrow accountant's view of the forest and how this had to be transcended. To come back to Dr. Karanth, the crackdown on safari outfitters and poachers was remarkably similar to the drive against black marketing and hoarding. Those of you who follow Hindi cinema would recall that in films as diverse as Prem Pujari starring the great Devanand or Roti Kapda and Makan starring the great Manoj Kumar, the evil figure is the corrupt businessman. It is no coincidence, of course, that many of the safari companies were run by princes and many of the members of the Chamber of Princes were themselves avid shikaris. A very important person who was a spokesperson of this lobby actually participated in one of the committee meetings of the IUCN, a legendary figure in Indian politics, killed very tragically by Maoists, and I've had the privilege of interviewing him in his late age, Vidyacharan Shukla. And Vidyacharan Shukla in one of the sessions remarked, he's not identified by name, but it's in the minutes, that we cannot afford to ban tiger shooting because each tiger brings the country 40,000 rupees in foreign exchange. So I think in 1972, there's a very interesting turning point where the tiger was declared the national animal. It displaced the lion, which had been national animal for a brief 3 years. And Dr. Karan Singh justified this by arguing that the tiger was a symbol of unity in diversity. It occurred in 11 out of 16 states, whereas the lion was found in only one state. The tiger, the first director of Project Tiger, Kailash Sankla, formerly director of the Delhi Zoo, would write, is the spirit of the Indian jungle. And there's something very fascinating in the fact that 8 states out of the 16 came together and declared tiger reserves in return for getting not only federal union government funding and aid from the World Wildlife Fund, which went on to raise $1 million globally for Project Tiger. And Operation Tiger, as they called it, much of that money came to India, not all. But I think it's very significant that each state which declared tiger reserves had to agree to the stipulation that each of the reserves would have a core area of at least 300 square kilometers, followed in most, not all cases. Ranthambore was an exception, where logging would stop. It's a very major change for the Forest Department, whose origins in the 1860s and long history was really that of a revenue generation service rather than a protection and conservation force. It's also significant these reserves included legendary reserved forests, the Banjar Valley, Kanha Kisli in Madhya Pradesh, the Cobbett National Park, which was of course the Haley Park as early as 1937, former hunting reserves such as Bandipur and Simlipal, or the Mayurband forests in Orissa. There were also areas in Northeast India such as Manas. What is important, I think, is that 1972 also saw the Wildlife Protection Act, which was the first federal legislation on wildlife since independence. And this period from 69 to 89 saw an expansion of the protected areas in terms of acreage tenfold. So by 2000, over 150,000 to 160,000 square kilometers had been declared as protected, either as sanctuary or national park. How and when did the tiger become Indian? Well, we can put a date to it. Sometime around 1972, the government records in India stopped referring to the tiger as the tiger or the Bengal tiger and started calling it the Indian tiger. Paul Greenough, the historian, argues that the tiger had become Indian. I'm not entirely sure because we do not know whether the tigers were aware that they were Indian. After all, Nepal launched its efforts around the same time. The Royal Chitwan Park, former hunting ground of the Nepalese rulers, was declared a tiger reserve and is a national park. Sukla Phanta followed soon. The rulers of Bhutan, not to be left back behind, declared the Manas area a tiger reserve. The newly independent state of Bangladesh declared the Royal Bengal tiger its national animal. Other countries followed suit. It's important to remember in this regard, because India was and remains the major habitat of the tiger. Largest numbers of tigers in the world are in India, for reasons I'll come to in a moment. But the pioneers of tiger conservation, for its own sake, were the Soviets. Right from the 1920s to the 90s, the Soviet Union expended enormous effort in protecting tigers in Siberia. Of course, they call it the Amur or the Manchurian tiger. And some of the very important biologists and foresters who worked on tiger conservation and wrote books, of course, in Russian, were killed in the defense of Stalingrad and fighting the Nazi forces around Moscow. In the 1940s, it once again seemed that the tigers in the Soviet Union were in trouble. A major reason was trade in tiger bone parts and skins into China. They recovered, and they remained so until 1990 when there was another collapse. The Chinese story of the tiger is very different. The great historian Robert C. Marks, in his book Tigers, Rice, Silk and Silk, talks about the tiger-sidal thirst of Chinese rulers in the 18th century when they gave out huge bounties and encouraged people to eliminate tigers so that vegetation could be expanded. This had its modern counterpart, particularly during the Great Leap Forward of Chairman Mao, when tigers were killed because they were seen, particularly in Southwest China, and I quote, as striped counter-revolutionary Kuomintang counter-revolutionaries. So the tiger killing was actually encouraged for ideological reasons. In the 1970s, particularly from 78, the Chinese started protecting their tigers. But by this time, across Indochina, in much of Southeast Asia, the tiger was already in trouble. Here, it seems to me that Project Tiger, as it was conceived, built on two very different kinds of foundations. One, which I have referred to, was the idea of nature as national heritage. This is a very significant point, and I think we should not underemphasize it. In his somewhat less well-known book, which should be read more widely, Ullas Karanth, A View from the Machan, shows that there was a forest minister in Karnataka who was from the coastal districts, and he took it upon himself not just to assist the protection of the tiger reserve in Bandipur, but also to protect other forests, because he came from a part of the state where the denudation of the lowland forests had been witnessed by him as a young man. There is a similar zeal in many of the state governments, particularly in their choice of the first field directors. When one looks at the work of H.S. Pawar in the case of Kanha or Fateh Singh Rathore in Ranthambore, or the legendary Sanjoy Devroy in Manas, you will get a sense of how there were particular cadre who had spent their life within the wildlife wing, who were given the chance to take up this task of creating the tiger reserves. There's a very interesting article in Cheetal, which is brought out by the Wildlife Preservation Society of India, which was largely ex-forester's body, and it's in the Kailash Sankla papers. You'll be happy to know just last week, my former university, I'm still associated with the archive, acquired hundreds of pages of the Kailash Sankla papers. It's got a delightful title. It's called Wing the Wildlife Wing. Well, that's what they went and did. But the other dimension of Project Tiger should not be forgotten. The steering committee had a very important member, N.K. Ranjit Singh, Maharaj Kumar Ranjit Singh, still has energy more than people half his age, in his 80s. And Dr. Ranjit Singh, Madhya Pradesh cadre, like our distinguished chair today, Raghav Chandra Saab. Dr. Ranjit Singh was, of course, from the state of Bikaner. And he was one of the very important people writing this steering committee report. And he has later argued, to my mind as a historian convincingly, that the notion of the core area where no humans may set foot, and the buffer area where human activity will continue, but under some safeguards for wildlife, has actually been taken from the Shikar Gahs or the Shikar reserves of Dungarpur and Banswara in Rajasthan. So there's a very interesting question. On the one hand, this Project Tiger was creating this protective umbrella for the entire ecological pyramid in these select areas. It was promoting a wider ecological consciousness. Sankla would use the term total environmental preservation. He had been the Nehru Fellow. He had done a study, and he concluded on the basis of Shikar records and interviews that the number of tigers in India around 1970 was around 2,500. The first census, it was done with pug marks, gave the figure of 1827. There are various figures, but none of them goes over about 2,000, very much over 2,000. What is important to me is that the pug mark to identify the individual tiger also goes back to the Shikar cultures, particularly of northwest and central India, in dry forests where tigers can be fairly easily spotted or located in the waterholes, which are very few in areas where the rains come quite late. So to carry on, I think that one of the interesting dimensions of the tiger turning Indian was the notion of diversity and unity of different ecologies and ecotones. This, however, did not always include, and in fact, it often carefully excluded resident peoples who lived in and around these areas. There were very important relocations, or I would say displacements of people within these reserves. Ranthambore is a well-known case. There were others in Kanha. The one which turned out to be most tragic was in West Bengal, 1977-78. There was a change of government. The left front government, which had a very good record of land redistribution, had many leaders, including its legendary Chief Minister, Mr. Jyoti Basu, who had played a role in bringing into the Sundarbans of West Bengal East Pakistan refugees who had fled for their lives. They'd been sent to an area known as Dandakaranya in central India, a very old place. It has a lot of associations with the Ramayana. Those who know their Valmiki and Tulsi and Kambar would know. And they were then brought back into West Bengal because both the opposition and the state government, who agreed on very little else, felt that the forest area could be cleared, the mangroves cut, and some rice paddies established for these refugees. Well, their areas became a tiger reserve. They refused to move, and this led to clashes, and many of them were shot dead. It's a horrific incident, studied first by a scholar called Ras Malik, and later in a wonderful and very, very moving book, very difficult book to read, The Forest of Tigers by Professor Anu Jalai, who incidentally is to join my university Kriya in a few months. The anthropologist's work was taken on by the novelist, who pays rich tribute to her, of course, Amitav Ghosh in The Hungry Tide. This might be a somewhat extreme case of direct confrontation leading to loss of human life, but there were many other cases in which people who were removed out of the forest got housing, they got some money, but they were unable to reconstitute the kind of livelihood they had within the forest. So conservation, which led to peace with nature, could lead to new frictions and conflicts with people. This had another dimension which shouldn't be forgotten. There were very major pressures for large development projects within many of the parks and reserves. The 1970s saw a major battle royale in the case of Silent Valley, and it's only as between 80 and 85 that the project to build the Heidel power plant, install a turbine in Silent Valley was scrapped. There was similarly a proposal for a dam on the Moyar River in Mudumalai, which was halted because of the intervention of a new body created in 1974 called the NCEPC, in which a very important young engineer turned environmentalist Ashok Khosla played a central role. So I think in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there is a new ethic of conservation, a conservation from above, which came to be important both at the union and state levels. When Mrs. Gandhi lost elections in 77, for the first time there was a non-Congress government, which is a tribute to the continuity of democracy that in March 1978, when there was the first International Symposium of the Tiger, it was inaugurated paradoxically by Babu Jagjivan Ram, who in 1973 had been the agriculture minister, and at that time forests was part of the agriculture ministry, and he had been quite intimately involved with the launch of Project Tiger. In his speech in March 78, he assured the delegates that the government of India was committed to Project Tiger. It was a national, not a partisan effort. Looking back 50 years, this continues to be the case. You are all aware there was a very major tiger crisis in 93 when many of the well-known tigers in Ranthambore were poached and killed. There was another in 2005 when tigers were wiped out in Sarista. From the very names of these tiger reserves in Savai Madhopur district and Alwar district, both in Rajasthan, you can make out Delhi dur nahi ast. Delhi is not far away. So the crisis which takes place in a place close to Delhi, the old imperial and now republican capital, has much more reverberations than crisis which happened far away. But one of the results of the second crisis was the institution of the Tiger Task Force, which interestingly is the first such force headed by a woman. A full declaration. She's someone I've known since school and college days when we were very young student environmental activists together. I mean, we like to think we're very young, but I think we're aging at the rate of 1 year per year. At least I am. I don't think Sunita Narayan is. And the Tiger Task Force report, among other things, reaffirmed the idea of preservation and protection. It qualified it. It argued that people who are relocated ought to get a better deal. It put down an amount, 10 lakhs, 1 million per family. It also laid out ways to distribute and share tourism revenues. And by 2005, many of these tiger reserves had seen an explosion of tourism, particularly the ones which had good road facilities and which were not too far away from large or small metropolises and towns. The other dimension, which I think is important, is that while the tiger has become Indians, Indians have aspirations. Democracy is about contests. And one of the important contests is about what is the forest really for? And one of the dimensions of the forest, which perhaps one tends to ignore. It is, of course, important in ecological terms. It may be important in economic terms as a repository of wealth, in terms of livelihood, but it may also be important in terms of a contest of rights. And much of forestry, certainly in the imperial era, many of the princely states, consisted of taking over areas from smallholders, from Adivasi peoples, from herders, and imposing the aspirations, desires, priorities of the rulers. Those of you who have read the Jungle Book would know what a great inversion happened in the 70s. Sher Khan, who was a very evil tiger who wanted to eat up the boy Mowgli, had suddenly become a symbol of Indian ecological patriotism. From the 80s, we start getting the first of the lavish color photograph books of individual tigers who come out into the open. They drop their nocturnal cloak. They are not scared of hunters. They come and stalk their wild prey using jeeps. We are told in Rajiv Gandhi's visit, the Prime Minister in Ranthambore, a tiger or a tigress came out of the forest, hunted and killed a cheetal in front of his jeep. I always wonder, did they maneuver the jeep there, or the tiger or the cheetal? I'm sure they did. But I think this is a very interesting instance of how much things have changed. However, in terms of the relationships of power with people, particularly people with marginal livelihoods and very tenuous land rights, very different from the overall picture. If you go back, one of the great films of the 50s, one of the greatest films ever made in India, based on a story by Premchand, was Do Bigha Zameen. And the role of the person who loses his land becomes a rickshaw puller, won the great Balraj Sahni Saab National Award. But this story of Do Bigha Zameen was not reenacted in the forest. I think it's very important. And it's not a question of land rights, it's a question of forest rights. And the Forest Rights Act of 2006 brought about a great division within the communities of conservation between those who saw the tiger conservation, preservation as vital, and others who saw Adivasi rights and those of marginal peoples as important. Today, I think we're in a very different India. And I want to end with two notes. On the one hand, there is widespread belief that the tide has turned. There are various debates about the tiger estimates. And since 2005, they are not based on pugmark censuses. They use the camera trap census method. They have a range. They don't have exact numbers. They also estimate prey. They look at foliage and ground canopy. And the broad view is that the tiger is not in danger of extinction. It may be possible with better protection to not only have reserves, but even have connected corridors. We have Dr. John Singh here. He wrote a fantastic paper last year in Frontline. To me, that paper reads like a monograph, how the number of tigers could go up from, 18 or 1900 or whatever the number is today to 3,500 with some very careful protection and perhaps some extremely well-planned relocation, but by keeping the corridors intact without major linear projects. And when we come to linear projects such as expressways, train lines, the Hubli-Ankola line, proposed expressway through a major national park in North India, the NH7 expansion in West Central India, the question of the Hasdeo Arand mine, we see a very interesting picture. We see the possibility of those who are looking at forest rights as rights and the possibility of looking at forest conservation actually on the same side of the fence. So right now there is a group of Adivasis who is on a peaceful march from Hasdeo Arand to Raipur, and they're protesting against the allocation of a coal mine, completely legally done, for a thermal power plant in Rajasthan, which is to get coal from this place in Chhattisgarh. This is a very interesting close canopy sal forest, which has an elephant population. So the tiger became Indian. India reclaimed the tiger, the land that had been famed for this beast. In an ultimate irony, and I'm quoting Mrs. Gandhi's words, was leading the battle to save it from extinction. The battle may have been won, but another set of new issues has come up. And that issue is, what is conservation really about? India may have saved the tiger. Can the tiger save India? I'm not meaning this only rhetorically, because one of the contrasts between the 70s and 2020s is that in the 70s, India was trying to find its own way. India is still trying to find its own way. It's too large a country with a complex history going back 5,000 years or more to fit into anyone else's camp or anyone else's narrative. But is India at all serious, and are we serious about finding ways to keep this peace with nature, but to complement and underpin it with a peace among ourselves? Can justice with other species, other generations, other ecologies, other landscapes, other waterscapes be accompanied by more equitable relations between different peoples? Can the search for peace in a democratic way be part of a search for equality? This is a very large political question, and I'm not even going there. All I'm saying is the question of the tiger and of nature today is inextricably linked with this larger quest. If we want to keep on this, a smile on the face of the tiger, we may need to start thinking a little more ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahesh Rangarajan. I'll request Deshdeep to please take over now. Deshdeep Saxena sir.
Mr. Saxena, you'll have to unmute yourself. Mr. Saxena, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I've unmuted myself. Am I audible now?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
Oh, it's a wonderful, very enlightening presentation by Mr. Rangarajan. And it raises many questions also, I would like to, just ask few questions to Mr. Rangarajan, if you allow me. You talked about the National Wildlife Board. Don't you think that it is now dysfunctional, almost dysfunctional? The meeting has not taken place for a long time.
Would you like to ask more than one question, sir, or would you want me to answer each?
No, I will.
I'm sorry, do you want me to answer this question, or are you going to ask me 3-4 questions and then answer? I'm very unclear. Excuse me.
I think, sir, Mr. Saxena's audio is not coming through.
Questions.
Okay. You can type the questions. So I think there have been different kinds of Indian Board for Wildlife. It was renamed National Board for Wildlife around 20 years ago. Indian Board for Wildlife was somewhat comatose before Mrs. Gandhi came into the scene.
And again, for about 7-8 years. When we talk about the protection side. No, you please go ahead.
No, sir. All I was saying is there have been periods in the past also where it has been comatose. It was comatose for a long period before Mrs. Indira Gandhi. It also was comatose for a long period before Dr. Manmohan Singh. So if you go back in the past, you will find this advisory board. It has become statutory only around 20 years ago. There have been periods it has been comatose. But yours is a very significant observation. I have nothing to add to it.
Do you think that the wildlife boards have become, the boards just for clearing the projects instead of protecting the wildlife and the forest?
No, I think this is fairly clear because successive ministers have said that it is a sign of success that the Advisory Committee on Forests and the Standing Committee of NBWL have been greenlighting projects. And there are members of more than one political party who have supported this. One of the very important members, who was a former journalist, now doing her doctorate in Cambridge, Prerna Singh Bindra, has written a whole book where she details how the Standing Committee attempted very hard to try and put issues on the table. They were allowed. Procedures were followed. But there is a larger question here, sir, which is that I think economic growth in a very specific way has been given priority over ecological security. And this is a wider pattern, and it is manifest definitely vis-a-vis nature conservation of wildlife sanctuaries, national parks, endangered species. There's no question, this is very much the case.
And when we talk, you talk, you were referring to people like
Sound is not audible.
So in the meantime, I'll ask you a question till Saxena sir's audio comes back.
Sure.
So, in the last 3-4 years, I have gotten the impression that the rangers are doing a good job in
They're
Indian
saying
forests
Mr.
and
Pawar.
sanctuaries.
Hmm.
And that lack of ammunition and weapons has
So
not been an
these
issue.
days,
Go ahead,
do we
Mr.
like people like Mr.
Sound is not.
Pawar?
Mr. Saxena, your audio is not clear. Okay, he's mute. Okay, let me ask the question, that I was asking, and Mr. Saxena can, probably try after that. That, last 3-4 years, the one gets the impression that
My
the
question
rangers
is,
have-
do we like
Mr. Saxena, I have muted you. I'll just finish the question and then unmute. That
go ahead.
the rangers have done have been doing a good job, and that lack of ammunition is not a problem. Is that accurate? And the second part of that question is that now that the defense minister has talked of 7 ordnance companies, should one of the ordnance companies be given a specific task of creating ammunition and specialized weapons for Indian rangers, which can also then subsequently be exported to Africa, etc. Do you think our rangers are sufficiently taken care of, or do you think that's an area that needs more work?
I honestly have no competence on guns, rangers, and weapons. I really know nothing about this.
Okay.
My only worry is my worry is that in this country, giving people weapons and equipment is one thing. How they use it, what it's used for, is another thing. This is true in all countries. So we should be very cautious about this. But it's a very important area, which honestly I don't have the competence.
That's fine, sir. That's fine.
Mahesh, can I add 1 or 2 points?
Please go ahead, sir. Most welcome, sir.
The guns can be used only in places like Kashiranga, where the poachers, come to kill the rhinos from outside the state. So the dead poacher, the forest department will be happy to see. But many places, the staff won't be able to use a gun. You take Uttaranchal, for example, Uttaranchal. The poachers may come from nearby UP. If they shoot somebody, that next day they won't be able to go to the nearby town. Same situation, for example, between Periyar and Tamil Nadu, actually. So in many places, the staff, will not be able to use the gun against the poachers and so on. That I think one has to remember, actually. In some places, the guns will be taken away by the Maos, which operate in those areas. So giving weapons like, guns and all to the staff, should be done with great caution, actually.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So can we request people to mute the mics? There are a lot of noise from people from the mics which are not muted. So Chitrangada, your question, the answer is evident in the question. You have asked that there is brutal eviction by forest department on ground of protecting the tiger. Communities are being moved to tiny corrugated tin structures in Simlipal, cut off from access to land and forest resources. So I'm clear the thinking in conservation continues to be what it was 50 years ago or earlier. It needs to change. And one of the problems is that conservation is not only about society-nature relations, it's about state-society-nature relations. It's also about a different kind of idea where, Dr. Asmita Kabra has written very extensively on the Kuno case, where most of the land right cases were actually quite well done. He points to a very important, phenomenon for the forest department and people involved in conservation. The relocation is the end of the problem. For them, the problem is people inside the forest. But for those who are displaced and relocated, or if you like, relocated and rehabilitated, the problems begin after that process because they have to make a new kind of livelihood in a new way. And she has also argued the issues of entitlement, livelihood, and dignity. It is not only about providing a house. So there's no question that we need to rethink our idea of conservation. My submission as student of history is that conservation is a very limited idea in today's world. We have to have a much broader idea, which can include ideas of preservation and conservation and protection, but needs to go much beyond that. It has to take into account the notion of a wider landscape. After all, even animals like tigers cannot be contained within reserves. Nature doesn't observe borders. And there are many economic processes beyond the borders which affect sanctuaries and parks within. So these cannot survive anyway as islands in a vast destructive desert. So one has to anyway rethink these approaches. And one very good way to begin is looking at resident peoples or adjacent peoples, particularly those who are underclasses who depend on nature and natural resources directly for a living. And this is a very, very important observation. And thank you very much for making.
So, Deshdeep ji, can I take over for a few moments?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So,
Please carry on.
yeah. So, Mahesh Rangarajan Saab, there are one or two questions which I have got from the audience, which I'm just mentioning to you. You can reply to them collectively or this thing. One is from Mr. Suyash Dikshit, which is a more factual question. What is the growth rate of tigers in India and what is their population and how does it compare with what's happening in the rest of the world? The second question is from Mrs. Chitrangada, which is about the Forest Rights Act, and that there has been a large-scale, displacement of people from Simlipal, etc., and they're pushed into thin corrugated structures. So, what is, really the right approach to that? And one question from my side. And since you are a vice chancellor and you've been a professor of environmental history, you're very closely connected with education all your life as a Rhodes Scholar, and in some of the world's top universities you've been associated. In India, do we need to bring in a curriculum on environmental conservation at some stage? At what stage should we bring in? How do we ensure that NCERT and the government of India recognizes that curriculum? And broadly, what should it cover? And how focused or how intense should it be? Should it be, a chapter in a book on moral science, or should it be a full-fledged course? Because I think, like moral science, environmental conservation needs to be built into our psyche and into our ethos as students. So you can, take your time and answer these questions. And at the end of that, because we are getting close to 7:30. So after these three questions, we won't trouble you with any more. Thank you.
Thank you. So Chitrangada ji, I have already answered. On the last, there's a Delhi High Court ruling in 2006, due to which in all the universities, you cannot get a bachelor's in any discipline without a course in environmental studies. The University Grants Commission has even put down guidelines. They don't enforce it. You may teach it in any way. And most universities have taken up this challenge. Delhi University, where I taught for 4 years, also did so. And you'll be glad to know that a very large number of students took up the concurrent subject, environmental studies. There were different designs, one in the sciences, one in the humanities. And our department, history, did it. So we did a book also. I did the book, Environmental Issues in India, Reader, and it came out in Hindi as well. It has two very interesting chapters on the tiger with very contrasting views. Dr. Ullas Karath, Strict Protection, and a brilliant paper, The Tiger and the Honeybee, incidentally on Simlipal, by Professor Sabyasachi, who's now in Jamia. My submission, sir, would be that the environment should be integral to the wider worldview, and there is no question it needs to be integrated in curricula, in ways of thinking at all levels. On the question of tiger population growth, I am going to request Dr. John Singh to step in, because I am a historian and I think he is the premier wildlife biologist, veteran of tiger habitats. I think there's very few people who walked as many tiger areas over the last 40, 45, 50 years as he is. Dr. John Singh, the contrast between the tiger population growth rates or decline in India and rest of tiger range states.
Before talking about the growth of the population, I will say rightly we have close to 3,000 tigers. And the population estimation of the tiger is being done using camera traps and so on. But unfortunately, the methodology, there is a variation from stage to stage. Same methodology is not being applied every time. So it's not possible to calculate the growth rate and so on, but we can say that confidently we have close to 3,000 tigers. And compared with the several other countries, we are doing well. Nepal is doing well. They have more than 200 tigers now. Bhutan, I would say it reached the carrying capacity of say 100 tigers. Bangladesh, their habitat is so poor for prey. Very few cheetahs, very few nilgai. I mean, very few wild pigs. They can't think about a very large population. In Siberia, Russian species is doing very well. I mean, nearly 500 tigers are there. They're taking a lot of care to protect them. But other countries like Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia, tiger has become extinct. Some are lingering in Thailand and Malaysia and so on. So when compared to other countries, India is doing very well. In my opinion, we can't think about a very large population because it can lead to enormous conflict with the people. When there is conflict, the forest staff who are working there, they'll be at the receiving end. They'll be beaten up. Their vehicles will be burnt. Their quarters will be broken and so on. I would say that we should be happy in India. The Indian subcontinent should be happy to have some 3,500 tigers and happy with that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
In fact, if I may mention, just as an anecdotal thing, that last year, 2 years back, I was invited to the release of the latest tiger census report, in which this figure of 3,500 odd or 3,400 tigers came up at the Prime Minister's residence. It was a very happy moment that the census showed that the population of tigers has increased. There is one more question from Mr. Ojit Kumar of the Department of Zoology Zoology Department from Ramjas College, in which he's inquiring Professor Rangarajan about your views on ecotourism as a buffer to environmental damage caused by rampant tourism. And I'll quickly read out a comment which Gopa Pandeyji, who's a retired Principal Chief Conservator of Forests of Madhya Pradesh, has written. Just for as a observation, relocation provides a dignified living life to people living in abject poverty for generations. They want to move out of fear from forests, from a primitive lifestyle to a better one, and therefore that needs to be looked at in a positive light.
So this is a very old debate, 100 years, whether the Adivasi society has a distinctive culture or whether it should blend into the larger culture. It's not possible to settle it today, but it's good that it is a vibrant debate. Just want to say, yes, ecotourism, there have been very important initiatives in Nepal, where over very large amount of the percentage of profits is shared with people living around the parks. And they have developed excellent areas for rhino viewing, for instance, in former grazing grounds near Chitwan. I want to end on a note as a storytelling historian that I am very struck that we are in Madhya Pradesh territory, and our distinguished chair has written book Scent of a Game, which is about the tigers and the genetic robbers and the cartels, and the tiger is object of protection, and some of the action is in Kana Park. I was very struck that one of the key actors in it is a lady journalist, woman journalist. It's very interesting. It also struck me one of the legendary officers of the Madhya Pradesh of ICS days was R.P. Narona, known as Ronnie Narona. And he famously said, nobody is fit to be an officer if he cannot drink from the same stagnant pool of water, which is the source of water for the tiger and the goat. Now, I don't think he meant that. But Narona was, of course, a very famous hunter. In his remarkable book, published posthumously, Animal and Other Animals, he even described tiger hunts in Bastar. So I think it's a sign of times that the state of Ronnie Narona has Mr. Raghav Chandra Saab, who is writing about conservation, and we are discussing the next 50, 100 years of the tiger and how to have peace with tiger and our fellow humans. It's a sign of hope, but it's also a caution that there are very difficult and complex issues up ahead. I want to really thank everyone. This has been a wonderful evening, and particularly on Sunday evening, 30 people of so many walks of life. It's a great privilege to have your company, and please feel free to send me questions. I'm putting my mail down. You can mail me at any time. I will answer. I will respond. Whether I can answer your question, I can't guarantee, but I'll try. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mahesh Rangarajan. Thank you for an absolutely enlightening, brilliant, and extremely lucid talk on the subject of tiger history. I think all of us understood it. It was intelligible to everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Deshdeep, for being here, for your very beautiful and illustrative remarks. Thank you, everyone, and the wonderful audience. And I will end by saying, when in doubt, consult. Thank you very much. Good night. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Namaskar.
Thank you. Namaskar.
Bye.